Today, I'm going to share with you some of the lead evaluation resources that we've created as part of this lead proof of concept project. But I also wanted to allow us all some time for reflection on our role in relation to the lead initiatives that we evaluate, and also provide some overview of kind of where LEAD sits in the national landscape of related efforts. So we're going to start with this piece of situating LEAD in the national landscape. Then we'll talk a little bit, hopefully you all will engage as well in some thinking and reflection about our position as evaluators in relation to this work. And then we'll talk about some of the unique features of the LEAD model and their implications for evaluation. And we'll have some opportunity to talk to each other in smaller groups about issues related to evaluating LEAD. And then I'm hoping we can also talk about the possibility of creating a community of practice moving forward so that we can continue conversations with each other about evaluation of LEAD, because I think it is kind of its own unique animal. And so I think that it's great to have other people that we can all turn to that have different skill sets and can help kind of fill in the gaps of our understanding and also work with each other. So I'll go ahead and start with talking about current conditions and the context that we're operating in. So the momentum of alternatives to the criminal legal system response that has fueled the prison boom has been picking up steam nationally in the years both leading up to and also following the establishment of LEAD in Seattle in 2011. This momentum has been particularly true following the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the increased attention nationally to the harms that are caused by over-reliance on the criminal legal system for things that it wasn't built to do. So this national dialogue has brought a broader range of people into conversations. Both government officials and private foundations are coming into conversations that have been going on within various communities for a long time already about what it really looks like to make communities safe. So in this context, a few different types of alternative strategies have cropped up. These include court-based diversion programs, therapeutic courts, violence prevention interventions, pre-booking and pre-arrest diversion initiatives, alternative response models like Cahoots or other things like that, and probably a lot more that I'm missing because there's a lot happening right now in this area. So I wanted to first start by talking a little bit about where LEAD sits within kind of the context of all of these different sort of related kind of efforts. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Rebecca for a minute to talk about some of the things that sets LEAD apart from some of these other models that are out there. So Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you for a few minutes.
Thank you. And you can stop share
Okay.
just because there's so many of us and I feel like I want to see people and not words.
Yeah, turn on your videos too if you're comfortable,
Please do.
everybody.
And yeah, we're so happy that you're here. We know a lot of you are researchers. We also know some of you are practitioners, for example, in the role of project managers. And I think everybody who's trying to do LEAD or do LEAD well can benefit from the work that our team is doing to sort of increase foundational knowledge about LEAD. We know LEAD is replicated all around the country and now internationally, and I am one of those replicators. I developed a LEAD project here in my home county, Northern California, in 2017, and I did as much research as I knew how to do. I tried to do all of my homework. I designed it. I got the funding for it. I was the launch manager for it, and then did my best to make my way through my understanding of what LEAD was. And what I discovered over time was that there was a lot more to LEAD than I understood. And I was interested to hear that about 35% of you think of yourselves as extremely familiar, because I've been doing LEAD for 5 years now, and I'm still deeply learning about what it really means. It's not just sort of a new operational approach to things. It's not nibbling around the edges. It has a deep philosophic intention. And what we've discovered over the last few years is that although LEAD speaks to a really strong felt need, which is we've got to do something better than we're doing if our options are for dealing with chronic complex conditions, behavioral health conditions, if our options are arrest or abandon, like that's not satisfying anybody. So let's do things better. So the sort of the proliferation of LEAD around the world has been driven by that shared sense of felt need, but we came to understand that it's hard to do it well. The LEAD National Support Bureau was developed in 2016 in response to the understanding that lots of places were interested in doing LEAD. But it's only in the last couple of years that we've been developing foundational resources around LEAD fidelity, LEAD evaluation. The proof of concept project that we're all part of is intended to demonstrate, support a handpicked selection of sites to develop greater fidelity and where we believe, therefore, greater efficacy and greater sustainability. And sustainability for LEAD is as much about local satisfaction as it is about pure dollars. The felt sense has to be that it's better to do LEAD than not to do LEAD, and that LEAD is more satisfying and more transformative than many other things that operate under the label of diversion. We really think of LEAD as existing at the intersection of health, safety, and equity. We also believe that imagining new approaches to public safety is fine, but you can't really shift things until you build those effective new things. It's not, theory isn't sufficient. Implementation is really what can build credibility and sustainability. LEAD started in 2011. It's now a decade old. When it began as law enforcement assisted diversion, it was sort of at the aspirational edge of the possible during that time. Let's just see if law enforcement is interested in diverting people out of the criminal legal system into a system of care. And can we build a system of care that begins to meet some of the needs that have been sort of papered over through arrest and criminalization? But as Emily says, in the last few years, things have substantially changed. And so the model has shifted. We think of it as LEAD 2.0, or let everyone advance with dignity, to recognize that while law enforcement is an important player in making sure that their work is aligned with the LEAD's intentions, that police officers don't need to serve as gatekeepers, that communities actually can drive diversion. At the same time, though, diversion has become a very elastic term, and it can mean almost everything or essentially nothing. And as Emily says, there's all kinds of forms of diversion, but LEAD is differentiated in a variety of ways, and I want to point out some of the high differences. LEAD is a systems change initiative. That's the most important thing, that has a direct service component. It's about changing the conditions in which systems act and people live. It's about pulling together all the system stakeholders who've always existed, who continue to exist within our sort of local ecosystems, but pulling them together for a new purpose and a new relationship. First response, all of the impulses and efforts to provide alternatives to police response to violent events. First response is just one moment. Shifting things at that moment is an important thing to do, but then the question becomes what happens after the first response. I often think of it as if I have a heart attack on the street, I'm going to hope that somebody is going to call the EMTs and they're going to send an ambulance. But once my heart is stabilized, we can't expect the EMTs to just sort of nicely put me off the ambulance and say, go do well. The ambulance is supposed to help me get introduced into a system of ongoing care. So LEAD uses diversion as a method to move people out of one system, but it also builds that post-diversion continuum of care, and it asks stakeholders to come together to build that system of care, to operate inside it differently in a collective impact initiative, meaning that all of the systems have to have mutually aligned activities. So I'll say a little bit more. Unlike in-field alternative police responses like crisis intervention or co-responder models, LEAD offers intensive, sustained engagement offered by street-based caseworkers who engage with participants mostly without police presence, rather than short-term and transactional interventions by police officers or crisis responders. Unlike divert to treatment models like PARI, for example, it doesn't dictate behavioral health treatment or sobriety as either a goal or a precondition. It doesn't ask people to opt into treatment as a way of getting into a system. For some people, that opting in is entirely appropriate, but for the lead participant audience, it's much more likely that there are far more pressing, urgent, immediate, like 5-minute long concerns, and a lot of wariness and distrust in people. So it's about gradually building faith with them, using relationships as the resource to foster incremental behavioral change in ways that people are asked for and say that they want, rather than as being imposed on the outside. Unlike post-arrest or pre-filing or prosecutor-led diversions or specialty courts, LEAD does not operate under the purview of authorities of the criminal legal system. It doesn't impose mandates or timelines or conditions on participants. And unlike traditional healthcare or treatment services, LEAD services are provided proactively in the streets and the shelters and parks, using harm reduction, intensive client-driven case management, rather than by appointment or in offices or clinical settings. So the way in which care is delivered and conceived of is very different in the LEAD model from sort of the ordinary operations. But the intentions are also to change the ways in which all the system's stakeholders behave, understand, act. So I think of behavioral change as something that we're trying to foster, not only for individuals who might be looking for that, living with chaotic and difficult lives on the streets, but also for system stakeholders who have a mandate, have a sense of responsibility to effect safety, health, or equity, but who may have been operating in silos or at cross purposes. So with LEAD, we try to bring all the system stakeholders together in a policy coordinating group, and then ask them to point not at each other to lay blame, but to point at the problem together and say, what can we do to make it better? That, I think, is the biggest difference for LEAD. Long-term systems change, collective, collaborative, leaving all of the bringing all the stakeholders to the table, especially those who might think of themselves as either unrelated to one another or operating at cross purposes with one another. And I think that process of cultivation is a very long-term phenomenon. So that's it.
Thank you, Rebecca, for providing that wonderful detailed view of what LEAD is exactly intended to be and how it might be different than some of these other models. The things that kind of I pick up on most in hearing LEAD stakeholders talk about LEAD are this, the role of LEAD as a second responder, that kind of divert to what question that they always ask, is it's, supposed to build up a system at the same time as you're trying to divert people away from another system. That piece that there is no sort of mandated treatment, that services are non-contingent and not, entirely abstinence focused, though some participants may have goals of abstinence. Abstinence is not a requirement. And then also this systems change, collective impact kind of framework, and we will be talking more about that in a minute. So thank you again, Rebecca, for providing that overview. Now I wanted to kind of zoom back a little bit because, I am an evaluator that has worked on a variety of other kinds of projects. I have been working closely with the LEAD Bureau, but I think that it's important to kind of recognize that, I am an independent evaluator, and my orientation as an evaluator is that I want to do applied social science research that actually is going to make an impact on improving the problems that I see in the world, whether or not that's LEAD. I myself am not beholden to the LEAD model. And so I thought that maybe, I do think that it can be an effective approach, and I'm excited for all of you here for building the evidence about whether, to see if that's actually the case. So I'm excited about this effort that we're all engaging in. But I wanted to think a little bit about this kind of bigger question of what it is, what is our role as evaluators in this landscape of efforts to shift course away from the practices that have fueled mass criminalization, whether that's working with LEAD or other kinds of initiatives that are trying to sort of shift away and provide alternatives. The term public safety, as it is typically used in our popular lexicon, is usually synonymous with law enforcement. So I argue that we as evaluators should be disentangling these two terms and thinking about what public safety really means. So in some cases, the police may contribute to public safety, but research also shows that criminal legal system contact has adverse effects on mental health in particular across all points of contact. And also that Black and Latino men are at significantly higher risk for death at the hands of police. And also that the concentration of incarceration within particular communities contributes to neighborhood and family disruption, which itself is a predictor of crime. So LEAD and these other efforts that are cropping up around the country focus on trying to disrupt this cycle and reduce the harms that are caused by a criminal legal system that was in theory created to make people safer. So the question here then is, okay, so if the current system is not contributing to public safety, then what could or what is? And so in my mind, this question about what actually makes communities safer should be at the forefront of our thinking when we're developing an approach to evaluating an initiative like LEAD. We should start by doing some thinking ourselves and also encouraging our practitioner partners to think about what public safety really means and what exactly it is that these initiatives are trying to augment or replace within the existing systems. So, like I said, in the work that I've been doing with LEAD, I've been thinking about my own personal position as an evaluator in relation to efforts like LEAD. And I've been having some conversations with other evaluators about similar things as well. And I'm curious to hear what you all also think about your role as an evaluator within this landscape of efforts to reimagine public safety. So I am going to ask us now to all engage in a little reflective exercise, just 3 minutes or so. I've created a Jamboard and I'm going to have you all just fill out some sticky notes and add some reflections. First, I'll stop sharing here. Okay. Thank you. I think that we're going to go ahead and move along. Please feel free to keep contributing if you want. What a lot of you have been saying here are similar to some kinds of things that that came out in conversations that I've had with other evaluators. I tried to jot down some notes, but there's a lot going on there, so I'm sure that I missed something here. But in these conversations that I've had with others and kind of looking at this first pass of the Jamboard organization that we've got going, there are a few themes that have emerged that I notice. First is that evaluators can build evidence that helps identify things that work and help advance and sustain things so that any innovative approaches don't fizzle if they do prove promising. Evaluation can also support efforts by helping practitioners identify potential issues and address problems as they arise. Depending on the evaluation approach and the position of the evaluator, they can also sometimes serve as a neutral entity in situations that can maybe be politically charged. This is something that came out in other conversations that I've had, not necessarily as much here. But evaluators can kind of help reorient people away from their own individual interests and opinions and back toward the problem they're collectively trying to solve. Somebody on the Jamboard mentioned, making sure that people understand that we're not trying to prove that what they're doing works, that we are trying to build evidence one way or the other and help them figure out how to solve that problem that they're really wanting to solve. If the thing that they're doing isn't working, that's just as important to find out as, if the thing that they are doing is working and they want more funding. They've got to be able to improve if they're going to actually make a difference and be open to that. So one evaluator that I spoke with also discussed how evaluators can kind of create opportunities for conversations around what alternative futures might look like and how we can, and we can also build evidence that lays the groundwork for communities to try something new. You know, with something like LEAD, the more of us are doing work that shows the efficacy of LEAD or inefficacy of LEAD and efficacy of other kinds of models, the more evidence we have, the more other communities can say, oh, you know, that thing is working, that thing didn't work, let's try that thing. So does anybody else have other thoughts about this kind of role as evaluators before we move on? No thoughts, no thoughts.
I feel like, hi, my name's Justine. I'm from Howard County, Maryland. And I feel like one of the things, it's interesting that you have the politically charged situations and just kind of thinking about funding streams, right? Because I'm a project manager. I'm always thinking about funding streams and what can come next, you know, and to sustain our program, because it's not publicly funded like the law enforcement community is. So, you know, especially when it can be a little bit more politically charged to support law enforcement versus these other initiatives when, depending on who's in office. And so we need evaluators to be able to say, this is what's working, and maybe it's saving you money, and maybe it's, you know, all these other, I loved the idea of thinking about what are the other things that contribute to public safety. And so I'm, you know, I just, yeah, I think knowing what's working and why and how can be really helpful when we think about long-term sustainability.
Thanks, Justine. Yeah, I think that piece about, you know, funding, you want to be funding what works and you don't want to be funding what doesn't work. And even if you're really sort of tied to a particular idea, being open to, you know, having the money go somewhere else if that idea isn't working. But it's important to have evidence for what is working if you are going to ask for more funding. And I think that's the thing that a lot of practitioners and program staff seek out evaluation for, is this question. And I think that's what that person was pointing out on the Jamboard, that you know, it's hard for practitioners to sometimes, you know, be open to hearing something other than it's working. But if you have a close relationship with an evaluator along the way, then hopefully they can help identify where it's not working and help you make it work so that you can build that evidence. Because ultimately what we all want is to make the world a better place. Are there any other thoughts or reflections? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. So yeah, I think that this, you know, this sort of reflective exercise, I just wanted to pose this question and think a little bit about this question, because I think that it's important that we recognize where we stand in relation to the efforts that we evaluate, and make sure that we recognize opportunities that we have to make the work that we do count. None of us want to just be, you know, doing research that's going to go sort of end up on a shelf somewhere. Some of us want to do that. I don't want to do that. And I think that a lot of us that are involved in evaluation don't want to do that. So I think having these kind of like periodic reflections on like, okay, so what is it that why am I here? What is it that I'm trying to do here? And also helping your practitioners that you're working with understand what it is that you're trying to do, I think can be a helpful exercise. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about the LEAD evaluation topic specifically. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the unique features of LEAD by walking through LEAD's theory of change, and then I'm going to introduce you to some of the resources that we've developed as part of this LEAD proof of concept project that Rebecca mentioned. Rebecca had to step away, by the way, so she is no longer here to answer questions about that, but Karina and I can answer additional questions about that if you have them at some point. So like I said, this proof of concept project, or as Rebecca said, the proof of concept project supports intensive technical assistance for a small cohort of LEAD sites around the country. Some of you who are here on the meeting today are evaluators of that small cohort of LEED sites. And so we've developed these resources as part of that project. But the intention is that these resources that we've developed can help sort of more broadly inform LEED evaluations to contribute to this kind of growing body of knowledge. So the LEED theory of change. As Rebecca said several times, the intention of LEED is to change whole systems. And because that is the intention of LEED, it's supposed to be operating on two levels, both as a cross-sector collaboration that's aimed at transforming the way that communities think about and create public safety, and also as a community-based response that provides direct support to participants who otherwise would become further entangled in the criminal legal system. So this is a picture that I drew of that's a high-level snapshot of this LEED theory of change. And this is intended to help us think about what LEED does and how it can have an impact on the individual, the program, and the system levels. So the backbone of a LEED initiative and kind of the glue that holds it all together is strong project management. Project managers are charged with facilitating relationship building and coordination between stakeholders who don't always necessarily see eye to eye. They also are charged with making sure that all of the pieces are in place to sort of make it work. That that there is strong outreach and case management for all participants and coordination on that systems level. So because they, are charged with kind of navigating a lot of moving parts and dynamics between agencies and individuals, they are supposed to be, in theory, a neutral, trusted partner of all partners. They have the capacity, should have the capacity to both track what's happening on the big picture and also the daily operations of a LEED initiative. So they really embody that commitment to systems change and LEED's essential principles and practices. The cross-sector coordination part of LEED includes those pieces that operate within policy coordinating groups. So those are things like developing shared vision, engaging stakeholders in making policies that align with the LEED systems change objectives. Both the backbone function, so both of these pieces, that backbone function of the LEED project manager and LEED's activities at the level of cross-sector coordination, those two pieces align with the features of a collective impact effort. That is a term that some of you may be familiar with and others may not be. The collective impact framework, I'm actually going to put a link to an article about collective impact in the chat so that you can learn more about that. Yes, Lauren, I now see your chat. Sorry, I missed that. I'll provide the slides for sure. Okay, so here's an article about collective impact. And so this is really like thinking about LEED as this kind of effort. It helps make LEED make a little bit more sense to me. Okay, so that's the kind of cross-sector coordination piece. The direct service component of LEED is the part that people typically think of as the LEED program. So the LEED direct service is the care coordination, the harm reduction style case management that happens with participants on the ground. So that is part of LEED. That is a very important part of LEED, but that's not all of LEED. So both levels of those activity, both the cross-sector collaboration and the community-based direct service, are working towards the same systems level objectives. That's what I'm trying to show here. So there are some outcomes that you could expect to see from the collaboration that happens within the policy coordinating groups and more and more frequently in community leadership teams as well. So there are some things that happen there, that might have a direct impact on policies and practices at the systems level, independent of what's happening at the case management level. So for instance, creating a PCG where there is a space for productive exchange of information, coming up with a shared vision among PCG's members, that might contribute to a reevaluation of budgets and policies within a jurisdiction. This could, in theory, lead to an increased capacity for public health response, regardless of the work that that LEAD is doing with participants on the ground. There are other outcomes that you would expect to see at the individual participant level that result directly from that work that happens on the ground. These impacts are the impacts that stem from diversion decisions or from other referral mechanisms that keeps people out of the criminal legal system and connect them with that second response, the harm reduction, case management, and care navigation. And so these outcomes are what people tend to fixate on in the context of LEAD. Sorry, I apologize. I should have my sound turned off on my phone. Okay, so the outcomes. So that's what people tend to fixate on. You know, that's a lot of times what's important for kind of accountability to funders and things like that. When you are building evidence of the impacts on the participant outcome, that can also contribute to outcomes on the program level. So there's a lot of, you know, there are things that happen kind of at a systemic level when you're connecting people with high level decision-making power in a variety of public institutions and nonprofits within a jurisdiction. There are those participant level outcomes. But then there's also action that happens within that cross-sector collaboration level that can contribute to impacts at the program level. This can be like, you know, the behaviors of people who are directly involved with LEAD in operation work groups or in the PCG. There could be individual behavior change for the people that are kind of in some of those key roles, like prosecutors who are sitting in OWG meetings, operation work group meetings, might make different decisions about charging and things like that, might kind of change the way they perceive LEAD participants, things like that. Police officers might also, who are involved in that, might make more diversion decisions. They might also change their perceptions of, you know, how they see potential LEAD participants and things like that. And it could be that case managers maybe change their perceptions of the police. So there's a lot that can happen kind of at that program level, both related to behaviors of individuals that are operating directly with the program that are not participants, and also the expansion of the program itself, either in terms of eligibility or geographic scope or things like that. So kind of the big takeaway from thinking about this theory of change is that the individual level outcomes are important, but we want to encourage evaluators to also think beyond those individual and program level impacts to this kind of transformative potential as a collective impact model. So almost all of you who responded to the pre-meeting survey that I sent out said that you were interested in talking more about the challenge of measuring systems change, which is a challenge, and I still haven't completely figured it out. But there are two resources that have been really helpful for me as I've been trying to think about how you might measure systems change. One of them is a guide to evaluating collective impact developed by FSG. I've included that in a Google Drive folder that I'm going to share with all of you in just a minute. So there's some PDFs in there that you can sort of download and look at to help fuel your thinking about measuring systems change. And there's also a book by Alnur Ibrahim. And in this book, I think it's, you know, it's really helpful as well. Ibrahim says, and I'm just going to read this quote. He says, any organization that chooses to work collaboratively with other actors must confront the problem of how to take credit for its role when communicating with funders. So he says that focusing on attribution risks undermining the collective efforts in an environment that incentivizes individual rather than interdependent behavior. So he argues that in a collective effort like LEAD, it makes more sense to look at kind of the constellation of factors that are jointly affecting a social problem rather than obsessing about how to isolate the causal role of each factor. This is really difficult, especially when you're, when you're talking to funders and you're talking about sort of, building accountability and not wanting to fund something that isn't actually working. But also if what you're trying to do is change a whole system, creating isolating impacts is a really challenging endeavor. And so he encourages looking at contribution rather than attribution. What is it that LEAD is contributing? How are they helping create, an environment where cross-sector collaboration can happen, things like that. So I think that this kind of thing, this contribution versus attribution, is something that we all intuitively understand. But then what does it mean for us as evaluators? So I think that we can still look at participant level impacts of LEAD in a way that more closely resembles traditional sort of behavioral health evaluation methods. But there are some other strategies that you can consider that might be useful for looking at systems change. So in terms of performance measurement at the systems level, this could be doing things like tracking the participation and engagement of partners that are part of the policy coordinating groups. I know that some of you have done interviews with stakeholders that try to look at some of these things. I welcome you when I give you the Google Drive in a minute. I didn't want you to be distracted, so I haven't put it in the chat yet, but I will. So there's a folder in there for instruments. If you all want to add your interview protocols to there to share with other people who might want to be doing interviews, that would be great. I also created a stakeholder survey that I adapted from an instrument that was used by some colleagues that are doing other work on a different unrelated collective impact kind of initiative. So I created a LEAD stakeholder survey, and I'll put that instrument in that. If I haven't already, I will put that instrument in the folder in the Google Drive that I'll share. We also came up with some ideas of metrics as part of this proof of concept work. We came up with ideas of some specific metrics that can be used that can sort of speak to systems change. And I will also share those with you in a moment. Some of these metrics include things like the jurisdiction level rate of arrests and bookings for LEAD eligible infractions, and racial disparities in criminal legal system outcomes. But, I'm sure that all you with your researcher brains are thinking about how, these kinds of metrics, including them as indicators of LEAD's success, kind of goes back to this question of attribution versus contribution. You can't really say anything with everything going on in the environment. You can't really say anything about LEAD's impacts on those jurisdiction level numbers unless you have additional information like qualitative interviews or surveys or things like that. There's this other method that I've come across in my reading called outcome harvesting, which some of you might be more familiar with than I. It sounds, the name of it kind of makes me feel weird, but what it seems like is basically like a qualitative decomposition sort of method. It's where you take the systems change that's occurred and you trace it back qualitatively to sort of look at what different factors within the environment had contributed to that change. So there's going to be some more time to talk about this when we get into our smaller breakout groups. I wanted to kind of give you what I know so far, and then hopefully we'll be able to come up with some more, have some more conversation about ways that you could think about measuring systems change. Okay. So now my next step is that I'm going to introduce you to some of these resources that we've developed over the past couple of years. So I'm going to give you a really quick overview of some of these resources, and then I'll give you a little time to dig through and familiarize yourself with what's in this drive that I created, and also maybe add some resources of your own if you have them. And then I can answer any questions at that point. The resources that I'm going to show you will eventually be housed on the LEAD Support Bureau website, and some of them are still under development. We wanted to go ahead and share them with you anyway, even though they're not published on the website or, you know, completely in their final form, because we want to help contribute to building this community of practice, and, you know, give you what we have so that hopefully it can be useful for you. But we do that with the understanding that they're going to be used with discretion and with proper attribution, and, you know, use these for your own purposes. But don't go around claiming that they're yours, basically, which I believe that you all will understand, you know, do that anyway, but I just had to sort of, you know, give you that caveat. So those of you that indicated on the pre-survey that you wanted to be added to a Google group of lead evaluators, I will send you a message when things are revised or when new resources become available. And if you did not fill out the Google form prior to the convening and want to be added to that Google group, to that list, I'm putting my email address in the chat, and you can just email me and let me know that you want to be added to the Google group. So that's on my to-do list for this week. So I will get that Google group set up shortly. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share a different screen and show you the Google Drive. Okay, so I will show you these 5 resources we created. I'll walk you through each one on the drive so you can have your eyes on them. Then I'll give you some time to look at them yourself, and then we'll have about 10 minutes to answer questions before we move on to the small group discussions. So for all of these PDFs that are in here, I'll put the link to the drive in the chat as well. For all of the PDFs, I would highly recommend downloading them instead of trying to open them in Google Docs, because the formatting gets all wonky. So be aware. So the first resource is this LEAD Race and Ethnicity handout. This is something that you can look over when you're planning your approach for collecting and reporting data on race and ethnicity. There are some pointers in here for structuring questions to collect race and ethnicity data from participants. There's ideas of evaluation questions related to race and ethnicity that you might want to ask. And then there's also a bunch of resources, links to other resources that are related to specifically to equity and data analysis and evaluation. So there's some good resources in there. The lead logic model, we put this together to serve as kind of a general guide, and we intend for it to be adapted to different local contexts as needed. But we wanted to kind of have something out there as a resource, as a starting place, so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel when they're coming up with their logic models. This includes things that we think are most relevant and important for LEAD, including the inputs, outputs, and outcomes that reflect both levels of activity, both the cross-sector collaboration and the direct service components. So again, I'm going quick, but you'll have time to look at all of these. So as a companion to the logic model, we also created a data collection framework, and this maps specific metrics onto the logic model. So there's these 3 tabs that are all the way at the end: participant, program, and systems level data, where it shows like where on the logic model you would want to, like, there's specific metrics where they, as they relate to specific sections of the logic model. And then I also just kind of put some possible evaluation questions you might be able to look at or answer by looking at that metric. So we distilled all of these participant, program, and systems level metric down into what we thought were the most important and put them in this recommended for all sites tab. So that has outcomes at all 3 levels, metrics at all 3 levels there. And then there's also some tabs. So if you download this and work with it, there's also a tab for sites to make their own logic model and data framework. So that's in there. And then the last big one, oh wait, no, there's 2 more. So the lead fidelity framework right here. If you download this, it's a clickable document, so you can kind of bounce around within it pretty easily. So this fidelity framework identifies critical components of the lead model that can allow you to sort of look at the extent to which the lead initiative that you are evaluating maps on or aligns to the lead model as intended. So as there are more and more lead initiatives that are cropping up around the country and around the world, and evaluations of lead initiatives, this framework can help speak to questions about how different configurations of the critical components contribute to different kinds of impacts, or what kinds of impacts adaptations to the model can have in different contexts, and maybe what kinds of challenges related to implementation cause initiatives to stray from fidelity with this model, things like that. So paying attention to fidelity can also speak to questions about whether the evaluation results that you all are coming up with are reflecting findings about the lead model itself, or local adaptations of the lead model and/or. So again, you download it, you can click on it, and it'll take you to different pages in the document that provide it's like a definition and kind of the reasoning behind that component for each of the components on the fidelity framework. And I put that together in collaboration with the folks at the Support Bureau, who are the creators of the model itself. So this is just supposed to, define the model. And then as a companion to that, I also created a template for doing like a self-assessment of fidelity for sites. So that is in there as well. As with all of the rest of the stuff, this is something that I created for use with proof of concept sites and some other sites in Washington. It eventually, we are hopefully going to be able to get it built on the website rather than having it as a Google form. But as of now, this is what we've got. You're free to use it for your own purposes, but please, again, be cognizant of intellectual property, use it for your own purposes, but don't claim that you made it. But you do use it, because I think it can be really helpful. So that's that. And then the last thing is there's a folder in here called Considerations for Cost-Related Studies of LEAD. So we worked together as part of the Proof of Concept project. We worked with an economist to create a memo and a webinar on considerations for cost-related studies of LEAD. And this is a tricky topic because of those systems change objectives that we've been talking about. And the complexities are all described within that memo. I'm also putting a link in the chat to a YouTube video of the webinar that Dr. Hunt put on about this topic. So